Hi, everybody. It's Steve Mitchell. I want to wish you all a Happy New Year and thank you for checking in on our Patreon podcast. We are getting ready to go into production on our feature-length documentary, True Believers, which is the story of the first wave of comic book fans that became professionals. We're very excited about the project. We think it'll add some depth and texture to comics history, maybe in the process, but I think will be fun overall just to have a different point of view about those who created comics and contributed to the pop cultural landscape that we know so well today. This is the first new podcast of 2020, and it will be one of many. And what I do is I share my experiences in comics, and I discuss some of the people that I've met over the years while I was in the business. It's a pretty interesting bunch of people, and I'm very, very happy to be able to share this with you because I think it's important to know the folks who created the comics more so than just looking at the credits on the title pages. Anyway, so right now, today, I'm going to go back in time a little bit. I'm going to talk about how I got my first job, my first paying gig working in the comic book business. Now, I was very lucky. I grew up in New York City, and one of the things that was great about that was I had access to the companies. DC and Marvel, Gold Key, Warren. Charlton was in Connecticut, and I did make one journey up to their offices in Connecticut with my dad, believe it or not, back in the day. But Charlton never had a New York office. But I haunted King Comics. King Features, which was a syndicate, had a comics line for a while, and they had offices. If there was a New York office, I was a pesty fan, and I wanted to meet all my heroes and talk comics and maybe get some insight because we didn't have the internet in those days. The thing that's great about the internet today is the companies are always talking about things that are upcoming. They want the fans to be knowledgeable about what's going on. But back in the day, 100 years ago, we didn't have that. In fact, there were very few venues at all to find out anything about comics. So fans like myself and Len Wein and Marv Wolfman, a wonderful guy named Mark Hannerfeld, who's not with us any longer. These are guys that I would run into at DC and occasionally at Marvel on the, especially at DC's tour. We talked about the DC tour in a previous podcast. And we just were hungry to know everything we could find out. We also were hungry to be a part of this business that we adored, that we were so drawn to, magnetically pulled to. And so I had a buddy when I went to high school. I went to the High School of Art and Design in New York City, which was an all-city high school where all the students were interested in art as some kind of a career. There was cartooning, architecture, fashion design, everything. All the various different professional or potential professional art disciplines could be studied to one degree or another at this school. It was a great school. I had tremendous experiences. But the best thing about it was about 2.5 blocks from DC's offices that were at 909 3rd Avenue. Now, 909 3rd Avenue was this great big monolithic building that took up, it seemed, almost a whole city block. And it was 2 blocks from A&D. So my good buddy, Alan Kupperberg, and I would go over there occasionally after school and, frankly, just bother editors. You know, we just wanted to hang. We wanted to be around it. Maybe we would get to see some new covers. We would get to see actual original artwork, which was exciting to us because this was the field we wanted to work in. And it was just an opportunity to sort of be nearer to something that was so incredibly important to us, so desperately important to us. I mean, I consider myself somewhat fortunate that I kind of knew what I wanted to do at a very, very young age. I think my parents thought I was crazy that I wanted to work in this business because they didn't understand it. In fact, I don't know if they ever came to understand it, even when I was a working pro. But one Easter vacation, Alan and I went to DC to just hang out, pester, ask, hope, pray that we would see something new and interesting. Because every time we saw an original, it was inspiring, but it was also somewhat educational. You know, when you see a printed comic, you're seeing it, frankly, badly printed. The printing in those days was not very good. It wasn't terrible, but it wasn't really good. It wasn't like it is today, which is very sophisticated and digital, and the quality of the color and the production is really, really spectacular. But in the day when you were looking at 4-color letterpress printing, it wasn't the same as seeing an original. And if you looked at an original, you try to study it and absorb it. And what Alan and I were trying to do was pull it into our zeitgeist, if you will. Try to see what we could learn from it. Because right at that point in our lives, we were sponges. We just wanted to learn everything we could from the people that we admired. So Alan and I were up at the DC offices. I believe it was a Wednesday. It was our Easter vacation. A long time ago. I won't give you a date, but a long time ago. And we're walking around, and the production manager at DC was this guy named Saul Harrison. Saul was probably a foot shorter than I was, kind of rotund, and he scared the crap out of me. He could just look at you with sort of almost a withering stare. He had his hands on his hips, almost like Superman, and he would just almost, without saying anything, dress you down and reduce you to, a pool of ooze or something like that, protoplasmic goo. I don't know how he did it, but he did it. And Saul, probably more than anybody else, and I came to find this out years later, cared more about the company and the product, and as he called them, the magazines, than anybody else. In a weird sort of way, Saul was kind of the heart of the company. I don't think he gets enough credit for that. Anyway, so there we are. We're in the halls, and Saul looks at me, and of course he stares me down. And again, I'm a foot taller than this guy. And he says, he had this strange way of talking. I'm going to try and do an impersonation. He said, if you're going to hang around, you might as well get paid. I like the sound of that. Come on in tomorrow and we'll put you to work. And I said, really? He said, yeah, be here at 8:45. So I think I was probably close to 8:15, and I did not live close to the office. I had to travel at least an hour to get to New York. I probably didn't sleep at all that night. I was probably so adrenalized, partly with joy, partly with fear. I was going to have to impress people. I was going to have to do stuff that I'm not sure I knew how to do, but I was game, and I think my parents liked the idea that I was going to get paid. So I showed up, and what I did was I worked for 2 days in the production department. Now, the production department would probably be called the art department somewhere else, but production is where all the books came in and lettering corrections were done, paste-ups were done. They would make copies of the material. They would add photostatic stuff like logos, etc. But basically, or art corrections would be made. And it was this hub of activity. Not that big, actually. It was, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, maybe 8 drawing boards. Jack Adler, who was the assistant production manager who worked with Saul for decades, had a desk. Saul had his own corner office, but with glass walls, but he still had a door and he could close it. And the production department was in the corner of the DC floor, which was on the 20th floor of 909 3rd Avenue. It had the most picturesque view of the east side of Manhattan, looking west and looking north. It was a gazillion-dollar view, frankly, and it kind of spoiled me a little bit. I was so used to saying, well, this is where you work to make comics. You work sort of in the heavens above the streets of New York City. It was very, very cool. Now, the room was filled with a bunch of interesting characters. There was a guy in the room who primarily did lettering and lettering corrections, and his name was, somewhat coincidentally, Joe Letterise. I thought, just based on his name, he knew what he wanted to do for a living. I never asked him about that. And then there was a guy named Morris Waldinger who had done some artwork, I believe, for Charlton, but never quite made it as an artist. But he had skills, and he was useful. They had another guy who would occasionally do some lettering. His name was Ray Holloway. He was a really colorful guy. He was a lot of fun. There was Jack, of course. There was this great gal named Gerda Gattel, who was this little tiny German woman who had kind of an accent, who was the proofreader of all things. She was in charge of getting the English right, which always sort of kind of surprised me when I was a kid. I said, well, she's the one with the accent, but she's the one correcting everybody's English. And she was a very, very sweet woman. I was literally, I think, 2 feet taller than she was. I'm very tall, in case you hadn't figured it out. But she was very sweet. She liked me. It was good that they kind of liked me up there. And I did the most ridiculous, idiotic jobs for those 2 days. I was doing Xeroxes. I was delivering things. I think at one point I went to get Carmine Infantino cigars. Carmine used to smoke a cheroot, kind of like Clint Eastwood did in the spaghetti western movies, the Sergio Leone movies. I had to go fetch them. But for 2 days, I was walking on air. I'm literally at ground zero where comic books are being made. The editors all had offices, and there were also these sort of nameless executives, and I always wondered what they had to do with the company. I still, to this day, I'm not entirely sure. But here I am for 2 days, having the best time, being paid to be in a place that I would hang out for free. And the great upshot of this was, at the end of the 2 days, Saul came to me and he said, you're okay, come back this summer. And so they were trying me out to basically be their gopher, the kid who does the stuff nobody really wants to do guy. And so I got myself a summer job from that audition. And it all happened because I had access to the company. And I came back that summer, and it was a great summer for me. One, New York City during the summer is a very, very uncomfortable place to be. It's hot, it's sticky, it's humid. You don't want to just hang out. It was nice to go to a modern office in a great building with a spectacular view, being paid, being cool, and being around cool stuff. It was one of those, I don't know, for me it was a dream. I don't know if anybody else has an equivalent to that, but for me it was a dream. And then I got to see on a daily basis all of this great artwork. Neil Adams and Murphy Anderson shared a room. They had their studio there. All kinds of pros came in to drop off work. Bob Haney was a guy who was if you were a credits junkie, Bob used to write Aquaman. He used to write The Brave and the Bold, which was Batman and a monthly guest star. He was there a lot. George Cashton, who was another writer who was a very dapper kind of guy. He smoked, and he always looked like he was going to be going to a cocktail party. George was around, and he always looked at me somewhat quizzically. I don't know that he trusted the fans or liked the fans, but he was very pleasant. I got to meet guys like Rick Estrada, who is probably one of the 3 or 4 nicest guys I ever met in comics. He was a charming, lovely man. And if you don't know his work, you should try and find it because it was very sophisticated and fun. Working up there was also one woman. There was one woman editor up there named Dorothy Woolfolk. And Dorothy Woolfolk had a history with DC where she had worked there many, many years earlier. And the legend goes, she was the person responsible for coming up with Kryptonite, because up until that point, Superman was completely invulnerable. He had no weakness, he had no Achilles heel, and somehow Dorothy figured out that Kryptonite might be a useful thing for Superman to have as an Achilles heel, because it could help create stories and create drama, and Dorothy had come up with that, and at the time, it was really a man's business. And then Dorothy left for a while and then came back, and then she was editing the romance books at DC. And she was a colorful character and a half. She was just, when she just came into a room, she just took it over. And again, another one of these great characters that I encountered working at DC. I got to know all of them. Julie Schwartz, who was very well known for being the Batman editor, and then, of course, he did Superman as well after Mort Weisinger left. Whenever I would see Julie, he would look at me with some level of contempt, and if I was going to say something, he would say, talk fast. which, of course, intimidated me, and then I couldn't talk anything, and then he would just move on. He was another one of those great Runyon-esque kind of characters. Joe Orlando, who ultimately became a bit of a mentor. He was a wonderful, wonderful artist who became, I think, one of DC's most interesting editors because he brought along a great feeling for experimentation. He edited House of Mystery and House of Secrets. He ultimately did Swamp Thing with Bernie Wrightson and Len Wein and had a lot of impact on that book, and that was a very unique kind of comic book, and historically now is held in the greatest of regard. Bernie Wrightson, a wonderful guy, a guy I know and I'll talk about in a future podcast, did some of his finest work for that title. And I think Joe helped encourage that. Joe was one of those guys who thought that just getting the book done sort of wasn't enough. And unlike a lot of the other editors, Joe used to take pride in saying, well, this is a Joe Orlando book. No one said comics, no one said title, they were books. Guys like Dick Giordano, who used to be at the office, had since left, but I got to know him, and he became a mentor for me when I started my inking career. And there'll be more about Dick somewhere down the line, but not today. And it was sort of a wonderland. It was to a normal, everyday person, I don't know if I can really communicate how just amazing it was to be there. The other thing that was weird was, this was back in a day when people had long hair. And I had long hair, like many of the younger blue jean generation that were coming into comics. But comics was a very buttoned-down business, but I wasn't a very buttoned-down kid. And there were times when I felt very weird and out to sea and a little underdressed, but, I was who I was, and they hired me the way I was. And ultimately, as time went on and fashions and styles changed, not being in a suit, not wearing a tie became acceptable. But all the older pros, interestingly enough, all dressed like grown-ups. I thought that was interesting. That when they showed up, they looked like they could have been going to any sort of office. Maybe they would go to an office that did advertising or a book publishing office. In fact, the original comic book pages were what they called twice up. And then eventually the pages shrunk to, I think, around 10 by 17 or something like that. And what was interesting to me was those pages fit very comfortably in an attaché case. Used to be you'd have to carry the pages in a portfolio, but they fit into an attaché case. And I remember Gaspar Saladino, who was one of DC's greatest letterers. He did so many of the logos, and he wound up essentially being the guy who did all the lettering or most of the lettering on the covers. Gaspar would come in, and he was always a very warm, funny, stylish guy. And I always called him Gas, and he would go, "Stephen, my darling, how are you?" He was just the greatest guy and enormously talented, but he always carried an attaché case, and he took the pages out of the attaché case, and I said, that's why they shrunk the pages down. Now, I think it was maybe an opportunity to save some money on the cost of paper, because all comics were drawn on this Bristol board, generally kid finish paper, which ultimately was expensive. So it was a way to sort of start to save money. And when I got into comics were starting to evolve from the way they were produced to the way they became produced, and they're probably very different today. Digital plays an enormous part of how comics are done and handled in production. In the old days, we used to use rubber cement, erasers, India ink, whiteout. It was all very analog, very hands-on. You had to have the hands, you had to have the skills. And one of the things that was nice about working over that summer, was to get a feel for working on the pages. I would do minor art corrections. I would do border cleanup. I would erase things. But I can't communicate maybe as well as I should or could actually being able to have my hands on the art and to make the most minor contribution to the final end result. But to actually have that tactile experience of handling art, looking at art, understanding, and God, I was soaking it in, I was absorbing it, was so important to my education, and I didn't even know it. Then also there were days when I had to get on a train and go to Bridgeport, Connecticut and take artwork up to the place where they made the engraving plates. It used to be the art was sent to Connecticut and they would make these literal metal plates of the black line art. And then they also did the color separations. And it was done almost, I think about it, somewhat primitively. But I had to make those journeys as well. And it was a great summer. It was a summer, I'll never forget because it was so important as an experience. I made money, which was great. But I also got to work around people who knew what they were doing and people that I admired and people who, in their own way, just by being around them, were teaching me so much about the business that I was dying to be a part of, that I craved to be a part of, to be around pros, to meet pros, to be around the Joe Kuberts and the Neil Adamses. And, I met Gil Kane, I mean, Kurt Swan, Dick Dillon, Don Heck. I mean, all of these guys who were working at DC at the time were all heroes of mine. And the good part was I was getting to meet them and talk to them, and occasionally I could talk to them about their work. But also I realized that human beings created comics. They weren't created by gremlins or elves that came in the middle of the night and snapped their fingers and the pages appeared. Human beings working hard, creating something to be consumed by the mass market. And at the time, comics were really more of mass market. It wasn't until later, especially in the 70s, when the comic book stores started to show up and they were becoming a little bit more niche oriented. They were being directed a bit more towards fans. There was no real such thing as a fan. I was a fan. Marv Wolfman was a fan. Len Wein was a fan. Alan Kupperberg was a fan. Some of the other guys from the New York area, they were fans. But the fans were not the target. The readership, the mass audience was the target. Now, one of the things I learned, I think that summer, or I learned very soon after that, was when Neil Adams was drawing Green Lantern, it was without question one of the best comic books that were being done. It won awards, it was lauded, it had accolades. As a fan, I knew that this was great and interesting stuff with wonderful, wonderful, important, socially relevant scripts by the great Denny O'Neil, who became a friend of mine. We'll talk about Denny in a later podcast. But I was also told that even though Green Lantern was a remarkable comic book, it wasn't really selling. It wasn't really selling to the mass audience the way, say, Superman sold. My understanding was at one point, Superman sold 2 million copies a month, or they ordered 2 million copies a month to be printed. So it was an interesting lesson to learn that it wasn't always about the art or the quality of the book. It was sometimes about the character, because Green Lantern was not as popular a character, say, Batman was at DC, Superman. The market was a little different than it is today. And it was one of the first lessons I had that you could do great work. The market sometimes would not reflect that in terms of sales. The market would not reward that great work with sales. I have to say, there was so much that I probably learned when I wasn't even conscious that I was learning stuff. And all I can say is it was a remarkable summer, the first summer I worked in comics. And it was an experience that I wish everybody could have in the industry that they choose, whether it's pop culture or in some other industry where you can essentially intern and learn kind of the fundamentals. You can see how it all works. You get to see how the machine works. You understand the process because it's invaluable. It's not just about making pictures in color. It's about becoming a professional and understanding how the business works, because that's an important component to doing any, I think, creative discipline. Learn how the business works, and that will help you with your art and will help you with your creativity. And, I got to say, thanks, Saul. After all these years, I don't know that I ever really said thank you. And I was one of the few people who liked Saul. Saul did not have the best or warmest of reputations because he was a little bit of a cold fish. But the one thing I learned that summer, and I learned over the years with him, was he wouldn't give you anything, but if you asked, he would, because he was very fair. And I think in his own way, he felt that if he nurtured guys like me and some of the guys who followed me, they'd be loyal to the company and they would be good for the company because they would learn how the company worked. You know, Saul, wherever you are, my hat's off to you. You were a great mentor. You scared the crap out of me, but you were a great mentor. And, I think about you and I miss you. I have fond thoughts. And here's a guy who never got his name really on the logo, on the title page of a comic, but he had a lot to do with the success of that company. And, for what it's worth, now you know a little bit more. So that's it for this week, or this podcast. Stay tuned. More to come, more news about True Believers as well, which we are really in the zone with right now, working on pre-production and lining up production. So until next time, thanks so much for listening. So if you have any comments, thoughts, or questions, please let us know. And if there's an anecdote or an answer I can provide for you, I will. Feel free. We want to make this an interactive site. And we will be doing these podcasts every couple of weeks. And there will be new stories, new anecdotes, new thoughts about my comics history, but also, and maybe at some point, we'll talk about making films, which is something that I also have deep passion for. And so this can be your site as much as it can be our site. And your participation is appreciated and encouraged. And so tell your friends, obviously, that this is what we're doing, and hope to speak with you very soon.